I am excited to get back into this study and kind of pick up where we left off. We've been talking about defending the faith, defending a belief in God, and eventually we're going to talk about defending Christianity itself. But we started a few weeks ago to look at arguments for the existence of God. And we looked at two categories of those arguments. And, I don't know if you remember that was a couple of weeks ago. So let me see if I can refresh your memory. Let's see how much you retain here. I'm not going to quiz you. But the first argument that we looked at was called the Ontological argument. And that was put forth by a guy named Anselm. And here's basically how it goes. God is the greatest being that can be conceived of. Anselm said things can exist in two ways. They can exist in your mind only, or they can exist in reality. To exist in reality is greater than to exist in your mind only. If God is the greatest being that could possibly be conceived, he must exist in reality. That was the ontological argument. We talked about the problems with that argument. You can basically use that argument for anything that you want. And so that's the problem with the ontological argument according to its critics. But that was Anselm. And then we talked about a guy that came about centuries later named Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas. And he said, I can do better. I could do better than that. And so he did. He came up with not one, but 5 arguments for God's existence. And we looked at the first 4 of those arguments, and they're called the cosmological arguments for the existence of God. And the first cosmological argument is the argument for motion. And Aquinas basically said, well, I look around, everything that I see is in motion. All objects are in motion. Everything that is in motion was put into motion by something else that was already in motion. And then he said, logically, what you cannot have is something called an infinite regress. You can't go back in time and have perpetually these things that were in motion and that were caused to be in motion by something preceding it. There had to be something that was not put into motion by something else. In other words, you had to have a first mover, a prime mover, an unmoved mover. And so he said that is God. And that was the argument from motion. The second argument is a lot like that argument. It's called the argument from causation. And it sounds very similar, except that causation has to do with being. Motion has to do with activity. And so he said, I look around, I see things. Things obviously have a cause. Anything that's caused has to be caused by something else, since nothing causes itself. But just like in the first argument, you can't have an infinite regress. You can't just go back, and have things that are caused by things perpetually. You got to have a first cause. You got to have something that wasn't caused to be. It simply was, and it causes everything else to be and to exist. And he says that's God. And then the third argument we looked at was the argument from contingency. He said there are contingent things. In other words, a contingent being is a being that exists on the basis of other things. And so, again, you can't have an infinite regress of contingent things. Things that exist. We even talked about this. We gave an analogy. We said that your being here tonight is contingent upon the fact that you walked in that door. You walked in that door because you came in the lobby. You came in the lobby because you parked in the parking lot. You parked in the parking lot because you drove here. You drove here because your house is too stinking far away for you to walk. And so we talked about how it's contingent. Your existence is contingent upon your parents meeting at one point. Not only that, your existence is contingent upon them falling in love. Not only that, your contingence is based upon them, I hope, getting married and then doing that thing that you're allowed to do after you get married in the sight of God that brought you about. You see what I'm saying, that everything is contingent upon something. But you can't have an infinite regress of contingent things. There had to be one necessary being that is not contingent upon the existence or the activity of something else. Well, that's God. Those are the first 3. The final argument the final cosmological argument that we looked at is called the argument from degrees. And he said everything has degrees. In other words, we measure things. We say, all right, this is tall, this is short, this is large, this is small, this is hot, this is cold. And we know how to measure things. We're not foreign to that concept. And the reason that we're not foreign to that concept is that we innately know that there is a standard of perfection by which all things are measured. There is one standard. It's like the old cornerstone in ancient architecture. There's something that everything else is built off of. That is, everything is measured by. And so that is the argument from degrees. And so there must be a standard of perfection, and he reasoned that is God. And we talked about the problems of all these cosmological arguments. You know, we talked about the fact that they don't really seem to establish the existence of any particular God. It could be used to say, you should believe in the existence of Odin or Thor or Mars or Zeus or something like that. It could be a whole pantheon of gods. So these arguments don't rule out polytheism. You could also say that Aquinas could be wrong about that whole there can't be an infinite regress. Maybe there can be an infinite regress. That would destroy those first three arguments of his. You could also say that these arguments are self-defeating. I mean, if everything has to be put in motion by something preceding it, why isn't that applied to God? Why does God get to be the one thing that is not caused by anything else? And if something can exist without having a cause behind it, then why can't there be more than one of those, you see? And so these are the comebacks to these arguments. They may not be the best comebacks, but it did allow for more discussion. But he at least came up with some arguments. He came up with 5. Now, we're going to look at the 5th argument that Aquinas came up with. This is not a cosmological argument. This is called, in your notes, the teleological argument. The teleological argument. It comes from a Greek word, telos, which means goal. Goal, all right? Logos means word or explanation. And so this is referring to the teleology of an object, that an object has a goal, and that you learn about that object by its goal, by what it was designed for. And so Aquinas gets the credit for coming up with this, but it really didn't take off. It really didn't become popular until centuries later, in the 1700s. There was an English Christian philosopher by the name of William Paley. And William Paley helps us understand the teleological argument by use of an analogy. Now, I'm a pastor. Analogies are my second language. I've already used a couple here tonight. And so we like to use analogies as pastors. Well, William Paley used an analogy to talk about teleology. And this argument, by the way, is also referred to as the argument from design. Maybe you've heard of intelligent design. There's a movement called ID, intelligent design, that creation, or at least nature, has a designer. It's here by design. They don't necessarily say it's God or talk about Christianity, but it's based on this argument right here. And Paley, he used what's called the watchmaker analogy. Anybody ever heard of the watchmaker analogy? Here's how it goes. You're walking along, you're outside, you look down, and there's a watch on the ground. Now, what's your first thought? Is your first thought, well, I've stumbled upon a watch plant. And clearly it's in bloom because there's a watch right there. It must be watch season. And so you pick down, you reach down, you pick a fresh watch from the watch. No, you don't. That doesn't enter your mind. What is your first thought? Your first thought is, well, somebody dropped this here. Somebody put this watch here. Why is that? Because clearly a watch has design. It is a man-made object. You pick it up, you look at it, you see there's moving parts, there's little hands going around the face of that thing. You can turn it around. You see that it's made to fit on a wrist, All right? This hand, sorry. And you can even take the back off and look at all the moving parts in there, the gears and everything, and how they're perfectly sized to move in conjunction with one another and move those hands around. And it's got a goal. There's a goal. What's the goal of a watch? It's to tell time. And so it's got design. Design implies a designer. A designer. And there are a lot of things that we interact with throughout the day that obviously have a designer. When you got up this morning and you weren't worth talking to until you went in the kitchen and you grabbed out of the cabinet a mug, and that mug was made by somebody, was designed by somebody. It's got a handle on it, perfect for your hand, and it's insulated and it holds heat, and you could fill it with the nectar of the gods, aka coffee. All right, which is also man-produced, right? You got yours, Frank? All right. But tools, tools are obviously man-made. A screwdriver, it's perfectly got the perfect shape on the end to move and turn other man-made things called screws. And so we see design in man-made objects around us. But Paley said, you know what? I also see design in the natural world. That you can look about you and you can see purpose. I want you to think of the things that your body does. Your heart does what? It pumps blood, which you need to circulate throughout your body, okay? So that you can keep going. And your lungs pump air so that you can breathe. And, your eye is this amazing thing that has beautiful design and the things it can do. It receives images and it sends information to your brain. And then your brain does things with that information. If a baseball's flying at my head, I see that, and it transfers that information to my brain. My brain sends another message to my hands, and so my hands go up to catch the ball or knock it out of the way, or I'm not quick enough and it hits me in the face. But your body does things. You've got metabolism. When you eat food, it doesn't just sit in your gut and rot. Your body does stuff with it, right? It converts it into energy. It metabolizes it. And such. And it even expels it when the time comes and all of that. But Paley looked at all this, and not just at humanity, but in the entire world, at nature. And he sees design. He sees the natural harmony that is there. There must be a designer. That is evidence of God, he said. Sounds like a pretty good argument, huh? I've got a guy that I respect named Ray Comfort. He's an apologist. He's written a lot of great books, and he's all over YouTube. He's an evangelist, first and foremost. But he wrote a book I read years ago, and it has one of the great titles of Christian books. It's called God Doesn't Believe in Atheists. Don't you like that? Kind of flips the script a little bit. And his contention is there's no such thing as an atheist. Not really, because the word atheist has a prefix, which means no, and theist, which comes from theos, which means God. The atheist says there is no God. The Bible has a word for someone who says there is no God. It's fool. But he says, the atheist says there is no God. Now, to say that definitively, you would have to have all knowledge. And so his comeback to the atheist is, now wait a minute, are you telling me that you possess all knowledge in the universe? And, a sensible person would say, well, no, I don't I don't possess all knowledge in the universe. And so Ray Comfort would say, okay, fair enough. Do you have 90% of all knowledge? No, I don't have 90%. Okay, how about 75%? No, I'm sure I don't have 75%. So you see where this is all going. So Ray's like, well, I tell you what, okay, just for the sake of argument, let's say you have 50% of all the knowledge in the universe, which is an amazing amount of knowledge. Nobody's got that. There's still half of the knowledge in the universe that you don't have. Considering all that you don't know, is it possible in that knowledge that you don't possess that there's a God? And they'd have to concede, well, yeah, it's possible. Okay, well then you're not an atheist. Because an atheist says definitively there is no God. What you are is an agnostic. Because means no, Gnostic comes from gnosis, which means knowledge. An agnostic says, I have no knowledge of God. I have no knowledge of God. Even that's not really true, according to our Bible, that all men know because of what we see in the created order, which takes us back to teleology. But what Ray Comfort does, he does in a variation on the teleological argument. And I've read this to you before, but I find it interesting. I think this is brilliant. He says this, he's illustrating absurdity by being absurd. And he says, here's basically what the atheist advocates for, the evolutionist. He says, billions of years ago, an incredibly big bang occurred. It came from nothing and nowhere, sending a massive rock spinning through space, which also appeared out of nowhere. And the rock cooled, and a brown, sweet, bubbly liquid formed on its surface. As time passed, aluminum crept up out of the liquid, formed itself into a can, and made a lid and then a tab on top of the lid. And millions of years later, red and white paint fell from the sky and formed itself into the words, Coca-Cola Classic, original formula, 12 fluid ounces. Now you say, that's ridiculous. And that was Ray's point. He was illustrating absurdity with an absurd illustration. But then what he says is, he says to the atheist, you go and find yourself a banana. And I want you to examine that banana, and you will notice that that banana has 3 ridges on one side, and on the other side it's got 2 ridges, and it neatly fits, I want you to notice, into the human hand. And I want you to notice it's been made with a non-slip surface, this banana. And I want you to notice that the outward color of the banana is an indicator of the inward contents. If it's green, it's too soon. If it's yellow, it's just right. If it's black, too late. You just throw it out or you make banana bread, okay? But I want you to look at the top and notice that just like that Coca-Cola can, it's got a tab. And you pull that tab back and you open it up and it opens neatly. There are perforations on it, and it actually slips, that container opens and slips over your hand just perfectly. And the contents are nourishing, and they're made of the perfect shape for the human mouth, and there are nutrients in there, and it's easy to digest, and even the wrapper is environmentally sound. It's 100% biodegradable. You know, and he's just trying to point out nature has design. That is the teleological argument. You like that? All right, so here's the summary in your notes. The summary of this argument. Number 1, the complexities of man-made things indicate that they are created by designers. Number 2, nature has complexities. Number 3, these could not happen on their own. And number 4, therefore, a designer or God must exist. Now, does this argument have problems? Well, sure. It's got problems because it's based on an analogy, and analogies can be undone by disanalogies. And so if someone can show that the first thing that you're talking about doesn't have all that much in common with the second thing, then you have an analogy that breaks down. And most of the time, analogies will break down if you think hard enough. And so here's one of the criticisms, if you care to jot it down, that not everything in nature has obvious design. That's the criticism. Not everything in nature has obvious design. I mean, obviously a watch has a creator. It's very intricate, but you can see that there are parts, and you can take it apart, and you can look at every gear that is in there. The natural world is not as understandable in the same way. Even your eyes, which are amazing, and there appears to be some design to them, but why do we have a blind spot? Why do our eyes possess a blind spot? I mean, is that the perfect design? Wouldn't it be better if we could just see all around us, 360 degrees? Now, somebody might come back and say, well, but God knows that some people are harmful, and they may try to hunt down somebody, a victim, let's say. Well, now the victim has an opportunity to sneak up on their attacker because of the blind spot that God gave them. And so they have a little comeback for that, you know? But there are things in nature that don't appear to have a purpose. Have you ever questioned that? You ever look at something and go, wonder why God made it that way? Why do men have nipples? I don't know. I'm not lactating. There's no nutrients in here, all right? So Paley responds to this, and he says, just because you don't know what the purpose is doesn't mean there isn't one. Just because you haven't figured it out. There may be a purpose, you're just not aware of it. All right, pretty good comeback. Although, I gotta say, if his whole argument is that nature has obvious design and is therefore meant to help you conclude that there's a designer, if we can't figure out what the design is, the argument kind of falls apart at that point, doesn't it? And so that's one problem with this argument. The next problem, if you want to jot it down, is that this leads to seeing design where it is not. And you start to imagine, here's the purpose for this in nature. You know, you might look at your fingers and you might say, well, obviously the purpose for this finger, God gave us a nose picker. That's what that is. That's a nose picker. It's the perfect size. I got 2 nostrils. It fits right in there. I can really, don't worry, I'm not going to demonstrate. But is that what fingers are for? Only when you're all alone, all right? But you can carry this too far. In fact, there's an atheist, Bertrand Russell, and he said, you know, obviously little brown bunnies have white tails so that hunters can spot them, and it makes them easier to shoot. And he's kind of pointing, he's making fun of the teleological argument to say that, you know, when we put ourselves in the place where we determine what the purposes are, what the designs are for, then we are making ourselves God. And that is the criticism of atheists, that we've put ourselves in God's place, or that they have, rather. But that is the teleological argument and some of the flaws there. Now, I want to move on to this next category. Let's talk about what I call the volitional arguments. Volitional, what does that mean? If you do something of your own volition, it has to do with your will. You have willed to do something. And so these are arguments that appeal to the will, along with practical reason. And, appealing to not just evidence or the theoretical. They're appealing to the will of man in a non-evidentiary way. And so there's a guy you may have heard of named Blaise Pascal. Blaise Pascal, French mathematician. He was a physicist. He was also a Christian philosopher. Lived in the 1600s. How many of you have ever heard the term Pascal's wager? Does that sound familiar? Pascal's wager. Well, let me tell you what that is. Here's the idea. In your notes, human beings wager with their lives that God either exists or does not. It's a wager that you stake your life on the idea that God exists or he does not exist. Okay? Your life is the dice and you're rolling it, all right? Now, I could not have told you growing up what Pascal's wager was. If you just said, define Pascal's wager, I couldn't have done it. But I had been exposed to it. And I didn't know it. Because my mother was and still is a pastor's wife. And she was an avid witness for her faith. And she sought to witness to people and win souls and all this stuff. And she did it in my presence with people. And I've heard her encounter people that did not believe in God, that denied Christianity was true, and all of that. And so I heard her on more than one occasion say the following. Okay, so you don't believe in God. You don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. All right. Well, let's just say that you're right. If you're right, that there is no God or that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then you've lost nothing and I've lost nothing. In the scope of eternity, I've lost nothing. I've just chosen to live my life a different way. But if I'm right and you're wrong, well, I've gained everything and you've lost everything. How many of you have ever heard someone make that argument? Yeah, some of you may have made that argument. Well, that, my friends, is a less gibberishy way to convey Pascal's wager. Because that's what it basically is. Here's the formal argument, if you were to look at it as a scholarly thing, summarized in your notes. A game is being played. Heads, God exists, or tails, God doesn't exist. Number 2, you must wager. There is no other option, and not choosing is a wager. Okay? Number 3, if God doesn't exist, the results of belief or disbelief are the same. All right? If he doesn't exist, whether you believed in him or didn't believe in him, you're not out anything. and you haven't gained anything. If God exists, number 4, belief brings infinite reward, while disbelief brings infinite loss. All right? So that's the whole, if you're right, you've lost nothing, I've lost nothing. If I'm right, I've gained everything, you've lost everything. And number 5, this is what we add. This is the part that my mom never said that Pascal would have included, which is this: the wager that God exists is the superior wager. The potential payoff is infinite. The cost of being wrong is minimal. Maybe that was conveyed indirectly in what Mom used to say, but in Pascal's own words, he would convey, listen, your best option is to believe. Okay? You might as well believe, because to not believe and be wrong, well, you've lost everything. And so it may have already occurred to you, this isn't really an argument for God's existence. This is something very pragmatic. In other words, if you're a skeptic on the fence, here's a good reason to choose one particular side. It's just practical. In other words, what have you got to lose by choosing to believe that there's a God? That's what Pascal is advocating for right here. Now, I'm not terribly crazy about an approach like that because it's, flipping a coin related to faith and calling it based on what you think is the best option. I don't think that's what Jesus had in mind. All right, but that is kind of the heart of this. Now, there is another volitional argument. It's from the 1800s. There was a Danish philosopher named Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard was known as the father of existentialism, and he came up with something in your notes. It's called a leap of faith. A leap of faith. Now, I know you know that phrase. Well, he coined that term, and it has to do with his volitional argument for the existence of God. And he said there's a difference between belief and faith. Belief, he said, is something that can be proved based on experience. It's very experiential. In other words, if you can believe that the sun will come up tomorrow. It is my belief that the sun will come up tomorrow. What do you base that belief on? Well, it's come up every day since I've been alive. Every single day the sun has come up. The sun will come out tomorrow, right? Bet your bottom dollar. So you're basing it on that. If your coworker shows up every day at 8 o'clock on the dot and has for the last 15 years, and you believe that's going to happen tomorrow, that's a safe bet. But you're basing it off of experience. Now, he would say, in contrast, Kierkegaard would say that faith can't be proved. I believe in Santa Claus. Can't prove it. Can't prove Santa Claus. But I believe, you might say. I have faith that I'm going to win the lottery tomorrow. I've never won the lottery. I've played the lottery, you might say. I'm not talking about me, I don't do the lottery. But you might say, I'm going to win the lottery tomorrow. I just have faith, okay? And then if you do, you give half of it to the church, and we won't tell anybody where it came from, all right? But that's Kierkegaard's deal. He says faith is based on emotion. It's not based on facts. It's not based on reason. When you have faith, you throw logic out the window, and what do? You take a leap of faith. It's a blind leap. There's no reason to do it. You're just going for it. You seen Indiana Jones at the Last Crusade? You know that scene where he's there's a chasm in front of him and he can't see the bridge, but he knows it's there. He just believes it's there. He's got faith. And so he closes his eyes and he puts his leg out and he steps, and lo and behold, it was there. He just couldn't see it. That's the idea here. He's saying when it comes to religion, there's so many paradoxes in religion and they cannot be rationalized. You cannot prove them. According to Kierkegaard, you've got to take a leap of faith. So it's not technically a step-by-step argument, but if it were, here's what it would look like in your notes. Summarize. Number 1, human existence is marked by uncertainty, leading to despair. That's where you begin. Number 2, religious belief offers a meaningful response to this existential condition. So remember, he's the father of existentialism. Number 3, matters of faith transcend reason and logic. So your life is in turmoil. Religion cannot be explained, but somehow faith will go beyond what you experience in an evidentiary way. Number 4, the only choice is to embrace or reject religion. Number 5, choosing to believe is a leap of faith, a personal, passionate commitment without evidence. No evidence, it's a blind leap, according to Kierkegaard. But there's a benefit, even if it's not true. Here's the benefit. Number 6, this leap leads to authentic faith and existential transformation. And so basically Kierkegaard felt that religion had merit, and a religious existence was preferable to life without one. He just said you're better off being religious, believing in God. So whether or not God exists doesn't matter. You should just live as though you believe in God. Even though there's really no way to know if he exists at all, it's still worth it. That's Kierkegaard. Now, this is hardly my favorite argument right here. Not at all, in fact, because it's got some problems. What are the problems? Well, with both of these arguments, problem number 1, if you want to jot it down, is that these don't really argue for God at all. There's no argument for God here. It's just we're giving you practical reasons why you should believe. You're better off. Or what have you got to lose? Things like that. And it really just sidesteps the truth question. I mean, somebody says, you know what you ought to do? You ought to believe on God. You ought to believe. I mean, he's the best way. And you don't know and you haven't figured it out, but you're just going to take that by faith. And you're just going to step out there. And maybe you're stepping into nothing, but you're just believing that you're better off as a result, and you're not looking for any kind of an argument that makes any sense whatsoever. It's like when your GPS tells you, when you're stuck in traffic on the highway, and it says, there is considerable traffic. You're still on the best possible route. Are you really? Well, I don't know, but I'm not going to, get on the shoulder and start driving. I'm going to take his word for it because he said so, right? You just wait till AI takes over the world and everybody starts going to AI for what it thinks is the best for you and putting all their faith in that. It could be a new religion. All right, so here's another problem with this argument here. It could, in your notes, justify belief in any religion. I mean, the whole what do you got to lose thing, somebody could apply that to Islam. What if Islam is the way, You could apply it to Judaism, Orthodox Judaism. No Messiah, just Jehovah, all right? You could apply it to Hinduism or some other polytheistic religion. Another problem in your notes, it downplays the role of reason or evidence. Because I'm here to tell you, Christianity is a religion that is grounded in facts. All right? Is Christianity a blind leap? No. We read a Bible that is a historical book. It is true. It can be proven true. In many ways, every thrust of a shovel in Israel will offer new evidence for the validity of the stories that we read in the Bible. We see prophecies that have come true. There's all kinds of evidence. The person of Jesus, he was a real historical person. There are eyewitnesses. He was really crucified. There are eyewitnesses. The Bible says he rose from the dead. We're going to talk about the evidence for that next week. So make sure you come, all right? And so when you do away with reason or evidence, and you say it has nothing to do with my faith, what are you left with? You're left with personal experience, which is subjective, and it allows for conflict with core doctrines about faith. And so I'm not crazy about the volitional arguments. Now, we're going to look at one more. It's in your notes, the moral argument. The moral argument. And there are two variants of the moral argument that we're going to look at. Now, the moral argument, in whatever form it takes, it's here, it's made possible because of a problem that we've talked about. It's called the problem of evil. You remember this? What's the problem of evil? The problem of evil is when somebody says, God, by definition, is all-powerful and good. Okay? We all would imagine that God is all-powerful and all good, morally perfect. Evil clearly exists. We see it all the time. We've had it in spades the last couple weeks, have we not? And so, how do you reconcile an all-powerful, good, loving God with the existence of evil? Because if God were all-powerful and all good, surely He would know, He would not be unaware of evil. He would know how evil would enter our world, and if He were good, He would do something to stop it or keep it from manifesting in our world. And yet evil exists, therefore I cannot believe in God. That is the problem of evil. And so to counter that problem, you have to come up with something in your notes called a theodicy. A theodicy. What is that? A theodicy is an attempt to show that the existence of evil does not overrule, it does not rule out the possibility of God's existence. So anything that is an attempt to deal with the problem of evil and prove that God can exist even though evil exists. That's a theodicy. Here is one such theodicy in your notes. It's called the free will defense. The free will defense. And it goes like this. Number one, God maximized the goodness in the world by creating free beings. All right? What does that mean? It means, number two, being free means we have the choice to do evil. We have the choice to do evil. We can do good, but we can choose as free beings to do evil, and it's a choice many of us exercise. Now, number three in this defense, God did not create evil, but evil can't be avoided without depriving us of our freedom. And a world without freedom would be a worse place overall. And so it's this notion that God made us. He made us in perfection. The world was perfect when He made the world, but part of that perfection is that we had a free will. Because He has a free will. We were made in His image. So I'm kind of getting into biblical understanding a little bit. But that is the argument, that we have a free will. That's why evil exists. If God wanted to eradicate evil, in order to eradicate it, He would have to make us robots. He would have to make us little automatons that were pre-programmed and hardwired, and we would have no will of our own. And is that any way to live? Is that loving by God? Is that what a good God does? Would you keep your kids locked up in their room all the time? Would that be loving to do? You keep them out of trouble. I only do it 50% of the time. But that is the free will argument. Now, there are some criticisms to this argument. Here's one problem in your notes. The free will defense only addresses what's known as moral evil. It only deals with moral evil. You see, there's more than one kind of evil, is the observation. In fact, we're going to talk about two. There's, first of all, if you want to jot it down, that moral evil. What is that? Moral evil is evil committed on purpose by humans. Okay, you come up and punch somebody in the nose, take their wallet, that's moral evil. You commit adultery, moral evil. You rob a bank, moral evil. All right? Then there's natural evil. Natural evil is evil we're not responsible for directly. Okay? When our basement flooded at the school, that's a result of natural evil. It's a flash flood. All right? I'm thinking about earthquakes. I'm thinking about hurricanes and tornadoes and tropical storms and the like. I'm thinking of disease. I'm thinking of cancer. All right? Natural evil. Now, how do we deal with that as Christians? Well, philosophy, this is a philosophical discussion. Philosophy doesn't typically involve theology, but we can explain this away. As Christians, as people of the book, all we got to do is pull out Genesis 1 through 3. What do you got there? You got creation. It was perfect. And then what happened? By chapter 3, the fall. What entered the world? Sin. What's the result of that? Evil. It affected not just man, but the created order. And now, you see Adam's got to deal with thorns and thistles. Before, he just reached out to the bounty of a branch, and what he found was his. It was there for the taking. Now he's got to toil and sweat and work at it, and his body will wear out. And the natural world now has calamitous things that happen, and eventually there's a worldwide flood, and all of these things. And so that's how we can explain that. But other than free will, what else can we use to explain and reconcile how a good God exists alongside evil? Well, enter Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant. He was a German philosopher. There he is, good-looking guy. All right. He came up with the first notable moral argument, and he observed a couple things. He said, look, happiness is something that we all want. How many of you want to be happy? Some of you, I don't want to be happy. I'm on a look like I'm weaned on dill pickles out here, and I'm going to like it. Happiness is what all human beings desire. Let's say it's an inalienable right, at least the pursuit of it. Does that sound familiar? This found its way into our founding documents as a nation. But Kant also said, in addition to happiness, morality is the duty of all human beings, that we have a moral responsibility. He said that our happiness and our duty combined is the greatest good that we could possibly seek, and we should seek it. All persons should strive for the greatest good, which is the union of being happy and being morally responsible. That's Immanuel Kant. But he said it's not possible because man is finite. And to achieve the greatest good, we would need to be immortal. And we would need the help of one who is already immortal, i.e. God. And so it's necessary, if that is incumbent upon man to pursue the greatest good, and yet man is not able to pursue the greatest good, it's a necessity, but it must be a possibility, and the only way for it to be a possibility is if God exists. And we can, by God, become immortal. And so here's the structure in your notes, the summary. Number one, we are morally obligated to strive for the highest good. Number two, the highest good requires the union of virtue and happiness. Number three, we're not capable of ensuring this union in this life. Number four, therefore, we must assume, A, the existence of God who makes the highest good possible, and B, the immortality of the soul for ongoing moral development, because we can't achieve this in this life. And so the conclusion is, while we can't know, according to Immanuel Kant, that God exists through theoretical reason, we are rationally justified in believing in God on moral grounds. And that was the original moral argument. Now, I think it's got some problems. In your notes, here's one problem. It assumes the highest good must be achieved. And by highest good, I mean as defined by Immanuel Kant, that is the highest good. Our happiness and our morality, that's the highest good. Is that the highest good? What if somebody said, wait a minute. Why isn't the highest good just morality? Why do I need to be happy? Maybe I can achieve the highest good without being happy. There's a whole lot of moral people not happy, but they're doing good. That would be one argument there. And so there is a little bit of a flaw with this argument. Now, somebody came along many years later that I believe improved on this argument, and his name was Clive Staples Lewis, or C.S. Lewis as we know him. You may know him as the creator of the Chronicles of Narnia, Aslan the Lion, of course, but he's also the greatest apologist of the 20th century. And I will happily admit to you that this is my favorite argument. This just my favorite argument. It's just my opinion. You don't have to agree with me. You may hear the argument. You may be like, I don't know if that's my favorite. That's okay. It's not a perfect argument, all right? But I do think it's one of the best ones. It is not the most popular among apologists today, if you must know. Most apologists that are famous, William Lane Craig, all right, his favorite argument is the second cosmological argument from causation. He also likes the ontological for reasons I cannot fathom, but I like this. And what Lewis argued is that there is a moral universal law, and it applies to everybody. And he reasoned that there must be a moral universal law, because if there were not, then all of our moral disagreements would really have no meaning whatsoever. Okay? If you pay attention to the news at all, what does the left like to cite? What name do they like to call everybody that disagrees with them? They call them Nazis. They call them Hitler. They call them fascists. Okay? And it kind of loses meaning because they throw these terms around. But there's a reason that they're using these terms. These terms do have meaning because they're rooted in history. And the Nazis were real, and they were awful. And fascism is real, and it's awful. But how do we know it's awful? Well, we know it's awful because Lewis says there's a universal moral law. And then he goes on and he says that all of us have been, or will be breakers of this universal moral law. We all sin. As Christians, we know this. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And but he's not even getting into Christianity yet. He's just trying to establish there's a universal moral law, and we all break this law. And everybody must admit that if somebody says, I've never broken the law, well, they're either crazy, or they're just unwilling. They're so stubborn they will not do an inventory of their own conscience. And then Lewis would say that the existence of this universal moral law strongly implies a moral lawgiver. It had to come from somewhere. The law had to have a source. And this source, A, gives moral commands, as lawgivers do, and B, is interested in our behavior, as moral persons are. And so he would say that the universal moral lawgiver must himself be absolutely good. He can't be imperfect in order to give a universal moral law that we're all expected to abide by. He would have to be the ultimate standard that law reflects. Does this sound like another argument we've already looked at? The argument from degrees, that we know how to measure things because there's an ultimate standard of perfection by which we measure all things. Similar kind of content right here. And so we must know that he is the standard for perfection. So here it is summarized in simple form. Number one, if objective moral values exist, then a moral lawgiver or God also exists. Number two, objective moral values do exist. We know it. We know it. Number three, some say, well, no, we don't know it. Well, I'll get to you in just a minute. But number three, therefore, a moral lawgiver or God exists. C.S. Lewis, his most well-known book outside of the Narnia books is Mere Christianity. If you are looking for a Christian classic to read, I would recommend you pick up Mere Christianity. You can usually find it pretty cheap. Here's some of the things that he says in there. He says, if there were a controlling power outside the universe, it could not show itself to us as one of the facts inside the universe. It would have to show itself as a law, urging me to do right and making me feel responsible and uncomfortable when I do wrong. He also said, these then are the 2 points I wanted to make. First, that human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way. Have you found that to be the case? And second, that they do not, in fact, behave in that way. Right? We know what we ought to do, but we don't do it all the time. You know who said something like that? The Apostle Paul. In Romans 6. Or Romans 7. Now, does this argument, you say, well, it's your favorite argument, Scott, doesn't it have some problems? Sure, it's got some problems. It certainly has some criticisms, which I will now give you. And then I'm going to give you C.S. Lewis's comeback to those problems. So the first criticism, and by the way, not all criticisms are valid, but the first criticism is that moral law is just herd instinct. Okay? You could see they'd make that argument. Well, that morality is just what the herd wants to do. It's just what everybody thinks is right. There's a general consensus, and they just all kind of go along with it because it's popular. And C.S. Lewis would say that what we call the moral law cannot be of a herd mentality, because the stronger impulse would always win in a herd mentality, and yet it doesn't always win. Morality, the moral law, does not always win. Herd instinct, it would always win. That's why we call it a herd mentality. And yet it does not. Clearly, people don't always, as a herd, do the right thing. Most herd situations are evidenced by the wrong thing. Very seldom are people good because of peer pressure, or everybody else is doing it. If morality were a herd instinct, that poor little girl on the train in Charlotte probably would not have bled out, because the herd around her just left. Here's another criticism in your notes. Moral law is a social convention. And Lewis said, I don't think so. Moral law can't be social convention, because not everything learned through society is based on social convention. Mathematics, that's not a social convention, and yet it is universally accepted. Logic, same. But it's interesting, Lewis notes, that the same basic moral law is the same throughout every society, throughout history, and that would not be if it were strictly a social convention. What we notice in history is that society develops. It does develop. Civilization develops. You've all taken Western Civ growing up, and you see civilization, and it improves over time. But that is not because things are invented along the way. Man is becoming more civilized, and they're becoming more attuned to what is innately there. All right? Or sometimes he regresses. But the standard remains the same. Here's another criticism. Laws of nature only tell us how things are, not how things should be. Okay? Laws of nature only tell us how things are, not how things should be. What's the problem with that statement? Lewis said, the problem with that is that the moral law should not be confused with laws of nature. The moral law is just this consistent truth by which we abide morally, or we're expected to. But you don't just assume it's the same as natural law. Natural law and moral law are not the same. Nature's laws are descriptive and prescriptive, they're not prescriptive, they are descriptive, meaning natural law tells us how things are. This is the way it is. Moral law teaches us how things ought to be. It's not always this way, but it should be this way. And so, if somebody trips me intentionally, they have violated moral law. If they accidentally trip me, they didn't see me, then they have not violated a moral law. They might still be responsible for my doctor bill, but they haven't intentionally done me ill. And therefore, it's a part of a natural law. Moral law, here's another one, is human fancy. Human fancy, it's just a whim. It's based on whatever a particular culture deems important. And Lewis says, no, it can't be human fancy, because we can't get rid of it even when we would like to. It's still there. It doesn't go anywhere. We didn't create it. It is impressed upon us from without. It's not a concoction. If it were all fancy, then all value judgments would be meaningless. Okay? After the George Floyd riots and all that stuff, what did the NFL do? They painted a message in the end zones, end racism, or some message like that. Now, you can say, well, that's virtue signaling. Maybe it was, but is it true that racism is wrong? Absolutely. Absolutely it's true. Absolutely it's true. All right? But the moral law is not a description or a merely human prescription. It is from something beyond us. There's something that extends beyond human fancy. Racism is not wrong because of what happened to George Floyd. It's just wrong. It's just wrong. Assassinations are not wrong because it happened to be Charlie Kirk that got assassinated. Assassinations are wrong. Murder is wrong. End of story. And we know this. We just innately know it. How do we know it? How do we know it? Were we created with this knowledge of right and wrong? Let's dip into theology for just a second. Where did this come from? It came from the Garden of Eden. God said, "You shall not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In the day you eat of it, you shall surely die." Well, we know how that story went. They ate of the tree. What's the name of that tree again? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What did they have when they ate of the tree? They had the knowledge of good and evil. Did they have that prior to eating of that tree? No. They only knew good. They only knew what God told them. They had never experienced evil. Now they had firsthand knowledge. Now they know right from wrong. And God sought to govern us according to that knowledge after that fact. Here's another criticism. Injustice disproves a moral lawgiver. Well, this is the big one. I'm willing to bet 80 to 90% of the atheists that you've met in your life don't believe in God because there's just too doggone much evil in the world. Injustice, abuse, human trafficking, poverty, disease. There can't possibly be a God that permits evil in the world. And Lewis's answer is simple, that the only way that the world can be imperfect is if we understand what perfect is. He flipped it on him. And this is true. Evil is an argument for the existence of God. You say, well, what about all the evil? You know what the question in response to that is? How do you know that's bad? How do you know it's evil? What do you mean? It's evil. Yeah, but why? Why is rape evil? Why is murder evil? Why is abortion wrong? Why is human slavery wrong? Why? How did we know that? You know that because written on your heart is the signature of your Creator, and He is the essence and the standard of all that is good. He defines good. Evil did not exist alongside God in eternity past. Okay? It came about because Lucifer said, "I will be like the Most High." And he was cast from the presence of the Lord. And then that same pride crept into the heart of man in the Garden of Eden. When tempted by the deceiver, you will be like God. Same thing he did. I want to be like God. I want to be like the Most High. He tells Eve, you will be like Him, knowing good and evil. Sin is the desire to be God, to put yourself on that throne. And so this is the moral argument. C.S. Lewis says, it's my favorite. Is it a perfect argument? No, it's not. It's not a perfect argument. Even C.S. Lewis said this doesn't get you within 100 miles of the God of Christian theology because there's nothing about Jesus. None of these arguments are going to win a soul for you, but you may meet somebody who's got some obstacles to belief. And if they are struggling with the idea of God and they say, I don't know, I don't know if I believe in God. I mean, I see all this evil in the world. Well, this could be a good tool to remove that obstacle and then open the door for the gospel, the moral argument. What if they say, well, I'd rather trust in nature. I don't believe in God, but I believe in nature. Okay, well then you can go to the teleological argument. Maybe that'll be helpful. Argument from design. They may say, well, but I think that everything has just always been, I believe in the universe and I believe that it's infinite. Well, it can't be infinite. That's illogical, an infinite regress. There's got to be a first cause. That's a cosmological argument. So these can all be helpful, but they're just something to help you put a wedge in there and open that door. And then you bring the gospel and you let the Holy Spirit do His job. And those are the arguments for God's existence, and that is way more than we have time for tonight. Thank you guys for your attentiveness. Next week, we're going to look at Jesus' claims to deity. And we're also going to look at the evidence for the resurrection. That's twice as much as I wanted to pack into that message, but I took a break last week, so you got a fire hose next week, okay? All right, God bless you. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for these hungry souls here tonight. Bless them on their way home, God. Thank you for reminding us of your majesty, that you are real, that you are with us, and we give you all the glory in Jesus' name. Amen. Hey, I'm Pastor Scott Grimm, and we want to thank you for joining us as we reach, raise, and release genuine followers of Jesus Christ here at the Lamb's Chapel. If you want to know when a video drops or when we go live, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And send this video to someone who needs to hear it. And make sure you invite them to join you here with us live this week. We'll see you soon.